We get the ferry, we go across overnight, we get there in the morning, we buy the drugs, we do the deal. I'd go off and rent a car, bring the car back, drugs were put in the boot. I'd drive us all the way back to Blankenberg in Belgium. We wait for sort of dusk, just like early evening, 5 or 6 o'clock time, and we get the drugs down on the beach. We contact Mick, who's come over in a boat. The drugs go in the boat, the drugs go off to England. When we went smuggling for the third time, everything went wrong from the start.
I switched on my mobile phone, as I thought I'd probably have a message from Mick or Jack, but there was nothing. I tried calling them on their mobiles, but couldn't get through, so I called Sandra and told her I was on my way back. I kept trying Jack and Mick on the way back to Braintree with no luck, so finally I tried Mick at home. Jackie Street answered. "Hi Darren," she went. "Mick's not here at the moment. There's been a bit of a misunderstanding. He was out fishing in his boat, and customs thought he was up to something, so they arrested him. Coming into Brightlingsea Marina. Everything's going to be okay though." Mick was a clever git. He knew only too well that somebody might be listening on the phone, and he wasn't going to give anything away. By telling Jackie that everything was going to be okay, he was giving me a clear signal that the drugs had already been unloaded, and that customs hadn't found anything. Mick didn't get home till really late that night, so I didn't get to see him until the next day. Customs had held onto the Range Rover and boat for forensic examination, and I wanted to get the full story. With a big grin on his face, he explained that once they'd unloaded the drugs and stashed them safely in Mick's mum's garage, they decided to get the boat out at Brightlingsea, where they'd been spotted by the harbour master, who unbeknownst to them had called the police. Mick's friend, Gordon Stevens, lived right on the beach, so once the boat was on the trailer, they all stopped off for a cup of tea. Jack remembered he'd left the lights on in the Range Rover and went to turn them off, but he never came back. When Mick went to find him, he poked his head over the embankment and saw Jack being interviewed by 2 coppers and dashed back to the house. He and Peter took all the incriminated evidence they could find, receipts from abroad, foreign money, maps, backup coordinates for the GPS, everything, and burned them in a toilet. Mick had been trying to avoid giving his name, because he knew of his track record they'd clap him in irons as soon as he did. Only they didn't. So he decided to call their bluff. Whilst they were waiting for customs to arrive, he made an excuse about needing to get onto the boat and deprogrammed the GPS. That was pretty critical, because the system stores all the coordinates of the last journey. If anyone had looked at them, they would have seen that Mick had left early the previous day, made a brief stop in Blankenberg, a brief stop in Point Clear, and then come back to the marina. Mick wouldn't have a leg to stand on, but as it was, he was able to get rid of the evidence. He still had time to kill, and the police didn't seem bothered, so he gave them a story about needing to get the salt water off the boat and began washing down the insides, hoping to get any loose traces of cannabis out, and he'd virtually succeeded. Mick was totally relaxed about the whole thing. In fact, he thought it was really funny that they'd blown it, kept right on laughing about it as he took me to his mum's garage in his Hilux and gave me a couple of kilos to sell. It was another story he could add to his list of narrow escapes. He was totally convinced that it was just bad luck that he'd been spotted by the harbour master, but I wasn't so convinced. Now, I've got no way of proving it, but I'm pretty sure I'm right about what really happened that morning. Everyone knows that customs don't find the call by pure chance. Most of the time they're acting on tip-offs. But when they swooped on Mick and Jack, I think they were acting on a tip-off that they should be on the lookout for a certain small boat coming in from the sea in the early hours. And who did the tip-in? I think it was Dopey Harris. Why him? Well, for one thing, that was the trip that he found out that we took the stuff back to England by boat. None of us knew about the second reason at the time, but once we did, it became blindingly obvious that Harris had absolutely nothing to lose, and £124,000 worth of everything to gain. I wasn't worried, just a bit pissed off. You always get someone who wants to try it on. They buy some puff on credit, have a few joints, then try to pull one over on you by saying it isn't any good and asking you to cut the price. You just have to be firm and aggressive. But this time was different. It wasn't just 1 or 2 calls. Everyone I'd sold to was coming back and complaining. And it wasn't like they were saying the stuff wasn't as strong as they expected. When I'd sold them short, they were saying the stuff was shit. Completely unsmokable crap. A couple of them were totally going mad. They thought I was trying to have them over. They were screaming down the phone at me. "What the fuck are you playing at? What is this stuff you sold us? 'Cause it sure as shit ain't puff. You're having a laugh, ain't ya?" I called up Mick and told him that Harris had ripped us off. It turned out he'd been getting complaints all night long as well, but couldn't get hold of Harris. We arranged to meet at a pub near his house, and he handed me a 5-kilo pack of drugs, wrapped differently to the rest. He asked me to test them to see if they're any good. I took them home and Sandra tried a bit, and immediately felt sick. It was all rubbish. Every last gram. I phoned Mick again and tried to break the news to him as gently as possible. I slowly explained that the biggest drug shipment he'd been involved in since getting back into smuggling, the one he'd almost got caught bringing into the country by customs, had been a complete waste of time. Still went ballistic. By the time I arrived at Mick's house early on Monday evening, his mood had gone from bad to worse. He was pacing up and down and showing me the pictures of this girl on the front of the local paper. He was really angry, stamping around, sweating, ranting and raving. He was saying, "This is bang out of order. This is going to fuck things up for the rest of us." Mick was particularly upset because of the girl's dad being an ex-copper. He was convinced that the bloke would pull in all sorts of favours, and thanks to the wall-to-wall publicity the whole case was getting, make sure the gang behind the pills were caught. As far as Mick was concerned, if the one of them got done and the police started looking into their associates, and he'd be in the frame too. It wasn't like the police would have far to look either. Tate was on the phone to Steele virtually every night, complaining about the dodgy cannabis shipment and demanding his money back. Normally Steele would have told him where to get off. That picking up a bad shipment is just one of those things. That he'd lost money on the deal too. But that would have only made Tate more angry, and he was desperate to get him out of his hair. The last thing he wanted was to be dragged into the Leah thing. Tate in the meantime was shouting his mouth off to anyone who would listen about how Steele had tried to stitch him up, and how he wasn't a man that anyone should ever cross. I think some of it was just bravado to make him look good in front of Tucker and Rolf, and some of it was just the drugs talking. I don't think Tate would have ever said any of it directly to Mick, but he did the next best thing. He told Sarah Saunders. Since she'd broken up with Pat, Mick had been spending more and more time with her, and was helping her in all sorts of ways. Mick thought of himself as something of a ladies' man, and had started to think the two of them might even have been having an affair. Mick wasn't scared of what Pat was saying. He was just pissed off that he was going to fuck the operation. At the end of the day, Mick had a good, clean, neat little setup, which no one knew anything about. It had gone completely unnoticed several times before they'd accidentally got spotted, but even then everyone had been released. But Pat was spoiling it because he was telling too many people. He thought the bit that we did was easy, when in fact it was the most difficult bit of all. Pat was always trying to set other people up to smuggle for him. A week or so before the bad shipment, he'd even had the cheek to bring in some bloke who'd only just got his pilot's licence, and insist that Mick tell him all about flying the drugs over the channel. But Mick wasn't worried about losing business as much as about Pat letting so many people know how he operated. Pat thought he was out of reach. Everybody was scared of him, but he reckoned without Mick. Later that night, Steele called up and asked if I wanted to go to Amsterdam with him. Apparently everyone else he'd tried had said no. They suspected that Harris had deliberately ripped us off, and that going back over there to try to get the money back was suicide. But Mick didn't seem worried, and that made me more confident. There was also the fact that, although I'd already spent it, I hadn't earned any money from the last deal, because I had to give it all back. I was desperate for cash, and Mick promised to pay me for the trip. Also, Mick only planned to be in Amsterdam for a couple of hours, just enough time to pick up the money and have a drink, he said. He'd done enough to convince me. Okay, Mick, count me in. I picked up Mick from Angers Green, and we drove down to Harwich in my old Land Rover, freezing our bollocks off all the way, because the Rover's got a window missing. We were travelling overnight, so I had a change of clothing with me. When we got to the ferry terminal, I booked the tickets in my name, got some guilders from the bureau to change. We were trying to make a holiday of it, keeping the mood light. We had a meal in the restaurant at the departure lounge, and had got a cabin on the boat. We had a few drinks in the bar where they had some live singers, then went to the boat cinema and watched a film, then went to our cabin to get a few hours sleep, before we arrived in Amsterdam. We met Dopey Harris in the bar. He said he was happy to give us the money back there and then, but he only had it in guilders. Harris wanted the drugs back, God knows why, as they were all crap, but Mick told him they were safe back in England, and that as soon as we had the money, he set up a collection. It was just after 10 AM, so Mick said we'd go back in the afternoon to give him some time to get some money together. No one was going to want to have to change their money over back in England, especially as banks and bureau de change have to report transactions of more than £10,000. We spent the day sightseeing, went back to the bar about 5 PM. Harris took us upstairs and handed over £30,000 sterling. He apologised, but said basically there hadn't been many Brits making sales that day, so there wasn't a lot of sterling around. Again, he said we could have the rest in guilders, but Mick decided to stay overnight and see what he could raise the next day. For the rest of the afternoon, we were either sightseeing or having a giggle in the red light district, or in some bar drinking loads of beer, or in some restaurant stuffing our faces. I was having the time of my life. It was the closest thing to a holiday I'd had in years, and Mick and I were getting on really well. That night we booked into the Delta Hotel, and I booked a twin room in my name. Mick didn't want anything to link with him, but gave me the money to pay for it. We put the cash that Harris had given us into the hotel safe, and spent the rest of the night out on the piss. It was nearly lunchtime when we got round to Harris's the next day, but he said we still hadn't left it long enough. We'd have to come back. That afternoon, Mick and I went to Madame Tussauds and had a photo taken with Tina Turner. At around 5 p.m, we went back to the bar again, and Harris gave us another £50,000 in sterling. He said that he might have more tomorrow, so we decided to spend yet another night in the Delta. By now, the novelty was really starting to wear off. I'd enjoyed it at first, but I was still wearing the same set of clothes that I'd had, and all the endless drinking and eating was starting to get really boring. We could never relax properly because we were so anxious to get going, but every plan we made to get a particular train or something ended up being postponed. Most of the Brits would go to Amsterdam to spend the whole time off their faces on Super Skunk, but neither Mick or I smoked the stuff. We just smuggled it. We went to Harris's yet again the next day, and he told us that he wouldn't have any sterling at all that day. At first, Mick decided to stay another night, and we booked the Delta again, but around about 5 p.m, Mick was getting so bored and restless with Amsterdam that he decided to accept the rest, about £40,000 in guilders. We went back to Harris's and told him, and he said we could have the rest of the money in 1 hour. In that time, Mick bought some phone cards. The batteries on both our mobiles were dead by now, and called up Jack Williams, Pat Tate and the others to tell them to come over and meet him in Ostend to pick up the money. Mick didn't want to risk being found with too much on him at one time, so the idea was lots of people to come over and take a few thousand back each. Harris told Mick that, with the way the exchange rate was, he had given us more than enough to cover the debt. He seemed very keen to make amends, and never stopped apologising for having sold us the dodgy puff in the first place. Having hated the guy's guts a few days earlier, we ended up thinking as he waved us goodbye and wished us well that perhaps he wasn't such a bad bloke after all. We collected our bags from the hotel and were just making our way down to the train station when I thought I saw a familiar face. Now, Amsterdam's a fairly small place, and if you hang out in the centre long enough, you do tend to see the same faces doing the usual circuits of bar and clubs. But this bloke didn't look like he was actually going anywhere. He looked like he was following us. I couldn't be sure. The bloke was quite far behind, and he may or may not have been with a couple of other people, but I thought I might as well mention it to Mick. It turned out that he had already spotted him, and was equally concerned. Instead of heading straight for the station, we took a longer, slighter, odder route. The bloke was still there, so we walked along a canal and popped into a bar for a quick drink. When we came back, the bloke was still there. The fact that we'd spotted him meant the guy wasn't good enough to be a professional, so the most likely explanation was that Harris had decided to arrange a nasty little surprise mugging in an attempt to get his money back. With that in mind, neither of us liked the idea of being trapped on a speeding train if it all kicked off, so we decided to take drastic action. When we got to the station, we nipped over to the road and jumped into a taxi. "Hi," said Mick, "can you take us to Ostend?" The driver's jaw nearly hit the floor. It was a bit like getting into a black cab outside Charing Cross Station and asking to be taken to Manchester. At first the driver wanted 1,000 guilders, but we offered him 600. Eventually we settled on 800, around £400, and we set off. We told him to take a scenic route out of the city, going around roundabouts several times, that sort of thing, until we were sure no one was following us anymore. It had all looked really jolly from where I was, but Mick was actually really pissed off. Tate was saying it was too late for them to get the ferry back, so they'd have to stay overnight. But they wanted Mick to pay for it, because they didn't have any Belgian money, and besides, he owed them for making them wait a week for their cash. I think by then Mick just wanted the whole thing to be over as quickly as possible. He was saying how out of control Tate seemed, how he was really hyped up over everything and behaving like a 5-year-old. It was getting really late, and he said I might as well stay as well, as Jack would be there soon. So I used my credit card to book into the same hotel as him. About 10 minutes later, Jack arrived in his transit van, and as Mick wanted something to eat, we all wandered up the road to this Greek restaurant for a snack. Jack had been so paranoid that he had worked up an elaborate excuse to explain while he was leaving the country. He was pretty freaked out about what had happened with customs at Felixstowe Ferry and wanted to make sure he had a cast iron alibi in case it all came on top. He had travelled over in his transit, and even had a spare wheel and brake drum in the back so he could say he was on his way to repair a vehicle. He even booked a commercial ticket which cost him around £220 just so it was all legit. So as in Sod's law, he didn't get stopped by customs once. Jack had 2 glasses of orange then left, taking half of the guilders with him. After that, Mick and I stayed in the restaurant and had a chat about what to do with the dodgy cannabis that Harris had sold us. After the experience of being followed, Mick didn't trust the guy at all and didn't want to risk handing it over to someone in Britain, just in case it turned out to be a setup. Just get rid of them, Darren. The whole lot, he told me. I don't care what you do. I just never want to see any of it again. It was just after that Mick first asked me if I could help him out. I don't remember anything about what I was doing, who I was with, where I was, or even the time of day. The only thing I remember was the question, can you get me a gun? We'd only been back from Amsterdam a few days, and Mick was saying that any sort would do, a handgun or a shotgun. I had a friend, Roy, who had an illegal shotgun, which he used for shooting rabbits, so I told Mick I'd ask him. Roy had sold his gun, but he told me to ask a couple of people and see what we could come up with. Over the next week, Mick called me virtually every single day to find out how I was getting on. I told him I wasn't having much luck, but he told me to keep on trying. I know it sounds stupid, but I didn't bother to ask Mick what he wanted it for. I know he had a bit of a rat problem at Meadow Cottage, and I guess I just assumed he was going to use it for that. Then as quickly as they started, the calls just stopped, and I forgot all about it.